Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is Janelle Blue, and our guest is Bob Dunfield. Bob is the Special Interest Group Coordinator for both the Mount Vernon and Fairfax Genealogical Societies on German research. And German research is, for many of us, quite a confusing way of doing things. Bob is going to talk to us about German research. And the first question is, how should we start our research on our German ancestors?
Well, it's like any other genealogical problem. We need to go from what we know to what we don't know. And I suggest that most people go ahead and talk to their family and try to find out as much as they can, basically, about their German ancestors, and then start with the U.S. records before we jump to the pond and try to all of a sudden get over to Germany, because it's not going to work. And there are certain things we have to learn through the records. Okay,
and what records would you start with?
Well, here again, as with the most common things that we do in genealogy with U.S. records, we start with the census, because the census is probably the best one that goes ahead and lays out the records for us. And unfortunately, the first 6 censuses don't give us very much help, because it only gives us head of household. But starting with the 1850 and the 1860, we get to see more on the family. However, it comes to the 1870 where they actually list whether or not they have people who are aliens or foreign born, that we can go ahead and start looking at that. And there's a place in the census starting with the 1870 where you list that. In fact, a lot of the material that's done, the earliest ones that does German mapping is the 1870 people that declared that they were in the census records. And here, this is where it shows here on the slide, place of birth, and this is where we start on that. And it just gives you whether or not your parents were foreign born, but that is a start for us to start looking for records about that time period.
Unfortunately, people didn't say specifically where they were from, and
No.
so they would just say German or Prussia, some of them.
Yeah.
Or they also give you an assortment of things, because I have a great-grandfather that he says he was born in Germany, as were his parents, until I get to 1920, when he says he was born in Switzerland, his father was born in Germany, and his mother was born in Switzerland.
Well, that's a problem that we have, is that starting after the 1870, that's when Germany becomes a nation, and prior to that, there was 37 states, kingdoms, principalities that you could have been from, and you weren't. But unfortunately, most people thought of Germany being that you spoke German, you came from Germany. It was a common thing early on, because most of the people that were coming out of southwest Germany in their early 1780s to the 1920s were coming from an area called the Palatine, or the Palatinate. And this is all of a sudden, the early Germans were not known as Germans, but Palatines.
Okay, and ancestors came over before 1820. We don't have the ship's manifests, unfortunately, and part of that was they really didn't care where you were coming from, but in 1820, Congress began to tighten things up and require those passenger lists. So, what do we have for sources that might tell us where they came from?
Well, you're right on that, Chuck, because we were British colonial powers, and most of the boats that could only come to the United States were either English or Dutch. They didn't need to have a passengers list. However, Philadelphia was one of the only few ports where the government thought there were so many Germans coming in that they were somewhat skeptic, And so they required people coming off the boat to be marched straight to the city hall and had to take an oath to the King of England. And because of that, we have records from 1748 to basically up to the 1900s, where we do get rosters of British subjects. And this is probably the only place that we can really look at that. But for a lot of people in who have Pennsylvania ancestors, this is a great place to start.
Yeah, another source that I have looked through is Germans to America, which is a series of books that has been published. Have you found it helpful? I haven't for my German ancestors.
I never found it helpful for what I was looking for, but here again, I think as we get more seasoned in what we want, and there's a lot more items to help us now on the internet, that we can be more focused on what we want to go ahead and look at and see. And we might be able to find them now in the Germans to America series, because we know what we're looking for.
Okay. Where do I look for records regarding ports of arrival in the United States?
Well, that comes in exactly what you were talking about, the ship's manifest, but the main ports that basically where the Germans came in, and where you should probably get most of your, or put your effort towards your research, is Philadelphia first, that came in. That was the main one. And then we had New York, Boston, and then Baltimore, and believe it or not, New Orleans became one because of the trade. But that all stops for New Orleans after at the beginning of the Civil War. Charleston had a few for the South, but it was nothing like they had on the eastern shore the eastern states that got the majority of the German ships that were coming in.
Well, of course.
Sorry, I was just going to put a plug in for Texas, because
yes.
there were about 130,000 recorded entries through Galveston, and that would have been the primary entrance, because if they came through New York first and then to Galveston, it wouldn't be recorded in Galveston. Right. But that started about 1846 and went about 100 years.
Yeah, and there's a lot of Germans that came in different locations. The ones I was talking about were the majority of the ones, but you're right to go ahead and say, hey, there's these exceptions to the rule that we have out there. And that was also with people coming into Louisiana, to New Orleans, that they may have gone on over to Texas when Texas becomes a republic and starts issuing the land grants and stuff like that.
I'm pretty sure they did.
Yeah.
It would have been a tough trek, but they would have come over.
Well, and I think one of the things that I found people have the misconception, and they don't really realize, people always think that New York was the big port.
No.
And in reality, it wasn't. Early on, it was Philadelphia. It wasn't until much later that New York became the port.
The reason for that is the Erie Canal, because basically that's when the big effort all changes from Philadelphia to New York, is because the access they have to go up the valley, and then the fact is that the canal's been built, and then they have access to the new Northwest Territory or the Ohio region, that all of a sudden cheap land is there, and one thing that Germans love is cheap land.
Well, and one of the other things that I learned fairly early on in doing research of ancestors coming in, a lot of it depended on the port that you were actually leaving from, where you may have actually come in.
Right.
I had Scottish ancestors that came into Philadelphia, but they came directly from Glasgow. I had a classmate in a class that I took that her ancestors went from, I believe it was Glasgow also, down into England, or down into England. And so they came over to Baltimore, took the train up to Philadelphia because it was cheaper coming into Baltimore from the port they were leaving, or they also came over from England into Canada and came down.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of it was based on trade routes or the fact of where there was access. But the earliest settlers we had coming out of what was called the Palatine region from the colonial period, southwest Germany, they were coming up the Rhine River and then being shipped out of Rotterdam. This is where the Dutch had a system with the British that they could come to America because they would dock to an English port and then they could go on. But also they started the indentured servitude agreement that they had, where the Germans didn't have enough money to necessarily pay for their passage. But such a deal I have for you, you get on my boat and then we'll settle up when you get off in America. And then they would basically auction you off for amount of service with a respective merchant or some type of a planner or somebody like that, and then you would work out a deal for 4 to 7 years of your hard-earned labor, and then you could become a free man and go buy land and all this other stuff. But in a way, that was white slavery or white servitude that we had, and we don't talk about that very much.
Well, and one of the other things I know from this class that I took was a lot of Germans went over into France and left from Le Havre and came over also.
The reason for that was Rotterdam ends up being a center in 1819, and then the Le Havre picks up the traffic, and one of the reasons that's going on is because of their cotton manufacturing that they have with the French, is that they're sending these boats over empty to New Orleans to pick up cotton, and they're saying, maybe I can make some money here by putting German citizens on here, or ethnic Germans, and send them to New Orleans, and such a deal I have for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's a book out called Coming to America. I forget the name of the author, but it's published by the Genealogical Publishing Company, and it's really an interesting read that talks about all of these different things and different reasons why people came over and the conditions that they endured coming over, and what happened to them when they got here to the United States. It's one of those things. I read it and I thought, why did my ancestors get on the boat?
Because they had a better opportunity here than the existence back in the home country that they had.
And the later ones probably had friends or relatives who were over here too.
The chain migration.
And so they knew that they had somebody to help them once they got here.
One thing I forgot to mention is the trade with Baltimore. Believe it or not, that all starts off with the tobacco trade. Now, basically, the ships have been coming out of the southern part of the Atlantic that had access to it. Bremen's the first one where we actually have more towards the central part of Germany, and this is because of the tobacco trade, and it develops that starting in the 1830s.
Weren't some of those Bremen records lost, though,
yes,
because the Germans uncharacteristically decided to...
Yeah, they needed to do some house cleaning, unfortunately, and then the U.S. did some other things later on in World War II and dropped some fire bombs, and they went away. But one of the things that's been nice is because we had our ship arrival records, they survived, and you can go ahead and rebuild a lot of those arrival records here that they had. Also, Baltimore has just opened up the museum there right in Baltimore, so you can go through to the museum. It's open only on the weekends right now, but you can experience what your ancestor did coming into Baltimore and all that they had. So
similar to an Ellis Island experience.
Well, true.
Probably.
Yeah, but it's not like everybody thinks my ancestor came into Ellis Island and you can buy the brick. But that's the big thing, is that there was a lot of other ports, and for the Germans, not very many. It was very late migration that basically come, and that's more towards the eastern sectors where the people were coming out of what is Austria, the Polish parts, and Czechs, and some other stuff that they had.
Well, one of the other reasons that I have heard that they would come to the United States was the fact that at 18, the boys were automatically drafted into the military. I did work for a client a number of years ago where the family had a son who was supposedly 17 and another one 16, and they were leaving Germany to come over to avoid that. And when I actually found them on the passenger records, evidently the oldest son was actually 18 and came in incognito because he was listed as Christina rather than Christian and was 18. So
it's common that they were doing that because they had so many wars that were going on at the time in Europe, back and forth. And in Württemberg, you had to have your service done to the king before you were allowed to leave. This is one of the things that we have on the Württemberger papers, that you had to put in a request to leave, but they had to make sure you had done all the things that the good king wanted you to do before you left, and a lot of that was military service. However, after Napoleon's era, the Prussians come over, and that's a big thing that they do, is so they can mobilize. They would put you into service for 2 years, and then they would put you into a reserve system that in case of a conflict, they could quickly call you up. You had basic training, therefore you were good fodder to go march against the guns. You knew what you were doing, at least which end the rifle fired. And that was a big thing with them. And that continued all the way till they stopped the draft in 1984 here in Germany.
Bob, where are those records again?
The records are at different places, but that's one of the, if you look at the Myers-Orts, it's when you look there, the BDO is telling you which military unit or region has the military records that they collected, and then they would go ahead and do it. That's here on the screen is the Myers-Orts site where you can go get information about your place of, once you identify what your ancestors' place of residence was in Germany. This is from all of Germany as of 1912, even down to the smallest town, that you can click on this, put your name in, click on it, and in there they'll go ahead and identify where you went to the Rathaus to register, also what was the military item or headquarters that you had to go to. And I worked later on with the Territorial Army in Germany, and they are still doing this practice that they keep track of you, and if they need you, they will knock on the door and say, come on in, it's your time. But that's a big concern, and we had conflicts that were starting after Napoleon. You had in 1848 you had a revolt along the river, the Rhine River. That's the famous 48ers coming in. Mm-hmm. There was bloodshed on that one. Then you had the Crimean War going on, not necessarily the Germans. Then we had the Schleswig-Holstein incident with up in the north with the Dutch. That was 62, 63. Then we had the 6 Weeks War with the Prussians against the Austrians. That was 1866. Then we had the French and Prussian War in 1871. So you can see there's a lot of fighting going on, and whether or not, well, maybe it's time to get out of Dodge, and I take that boat and go to America.
Once they came to the United States, citizenship records, if they became citizens, were a great resource of information, again, depending on the time period and all. What are some of the things or records that people used to prove their citizenship?
Well, there's here again, because the court records, you could get citizenship up to 1906 at any courthouse after you've done your time periods that you had for your naturalization. That's always kind of hard because people moved, and you could have done your initial papers, your qualification for your citizenship, and then getting your citizenship in almost any court. But I found that the Civil War pension records is a great one that lists where a lot of your information is that you had. Also, they started to naturalize soldiers at the time. And then the other thing is the Homestead Act. A lot of people don't know about the Homestead Act of 1862. One of the big things is that you had to be at least 21 and a citizen. And so when we were in the Natural Archives and when I was in NIRA, they actually were saving in the archival records part. They were the citizenship papers of different foreigners that were showing that they had done their time. Here's my record. So that's a big thing there. And that's one of the things that people forget about, is that the Homestead Act, your land records here could also show who was a citizen. And
wouldn't there be associated letters from other people saying,
right.
I've known this person?
Right. There's a possibility
really
that.
Good
and also in the Civil War pension records that you had a lot of people swearing to your character, how long they had known you, all this other stuff. So,
but the problem with the Civil War pension records is that's only the Union. Almost all of it is the Union at NARA.
Yeah, you're right at NARA, but if you're a Confederate, they have them at the state.
At the state level.
So at the state level. So and the Daughters of the Confederacy maybe be able to help you on there too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the Homestead records are great. I've used the records, and actually I have a friend, although her ancestors came from Scandinavian countries, but she had 5 ancestors that got land, and every one of them, she found the pension or the naturalization information in those records.
And that's something a lot of people don't think about, and I think it's a key thing that it states right there. You have to be a citizen to get the land. So.
One of the other things that we go after here in the United States, of course, is vital records. What do they have in Germany?
Well, here again, going back to the earliest records we had in Germany were basically all ecclesiastical records or church records, okay? And that goes on with the 30 Years' War. It's basically destroyed a lot of it. It starts basically around 1650 with the church records. And the 3 big church records that you would look for are Lutheran, Catholic, and Reformed Church, or the Calvinists that they had. Here again, the Prussians were more up north, were the Calvinist Reformed Church, while the southern part, where southwest, was the Lutherans along the Rhine, and then Bavaria, that area are Catholic. So that's where you would basically go for your birth, marriage, and death records. Now, all of a sudden, when the French come along, they sort of screw things up, and they start civil records. Under the French Revolution, they go ahead and say, hey, we don't like church records anymore. We're going to start civil records. And so along the Rhine area, Napoleon instituted civil records. And then once he goes away, that stops. And it isn't until the good old Prussians come along, and they basically, under Otto von Bismarck, they decide that they are going to institute civil records. And then that starts with the Northern Bund, 1869, for the ones that were not part of Prussia that had gone to the civil records. And then later, when they come as the Empire in 1871, it becomes all of Germany. And to find those, you go to the local Rathaus, and that's where you're going to get the family information. I did that with my wife's family. We went to the Rathaus. You got to make an appointment. you go in there and outlays it, and then when somebody married, then they put it into the other family deal, and then they'll go to that page and show you where you're now in this family, and all the people are related to that. So it's, and when I got married, I had to go get married first in the civil deal, take the piece of paper to the priest or the pastor to show that I was married, and then we could have the church ceremony.
Now, I found records in the 1870 range, now this would have been in Prussian-occupied Poland. There were both the church records as well as the civil records.
Yeah.
And the civil records were a wealth of information, because they not only said, you know, this woman is the wife of whoever it was, but by the way, he was a carpenter, or by the way, he was a renter even.
Yeah.
And so, wow, that's a good way to find out information.
Plus, the other thing is neat is that all the women, the men came to the women in Nordheim, basically 10 kilometers away, and they married the women. And it's interesting to go ahead and look at that type of deal where the cluster was, how that was the center to find your wife and to do it. But that also gave me the clue to go look later on to those villages to find those lines earlier on with them.
Janelle brings up a point, you know, finding the occupation. Just like many other places in Europe, initially Germans did not have surnames. You had, the surnames became part of your occupation, like me with Mason being a stonemason.
That was, I think, true until we started coming up with the surnames by red hair, Road, or you live by the fox, or whatever it was that you had. So that's one of the ones. You're right on that, on the naming practices that we had.
Well, we're just about out of time. This is a very interesting topic, and we appreciate your being here with us, Bob. We've kind of touched the surface.
Yes, we have.
At some point, we're going to do another program on history of Germany, but at some point I think we need to have you come back a second time to talk about other records.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and it's important to understand the history, because you can't do German genealogy unless you do that.
Okay, we're going to roll the credits and we'll sit here pretending.